Good morning, fellows. My name is Sabrina. I study international relations and economics, and today it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Manos Matsaganis. Professor Manos Matsaganis is currently a professor of public finance at the Polytechnic University of Milan. He studied economics at the Athens University of Economics and Business, received his master's degree in health economics at the University of York, and completed his PhD on health econometrics at the University of Bristol. Having worked in academia and government and for a variety of international organizations, his diverse professional background has given him the experience of considering public policy and its complexity through a wide variety of lenses. He worked for the Greek Prime Minister's office in the 1990s and has taught at a variety of well-respected academic institutions in both full-time and visiting positions. Additionally, he has worked with multiple international organizations such as the European Commission and the World Bank and sits on multiple editorial boards. His work has been published in a wide variety of journals dedicated to social welfare, health policy, economics, and politics. And while Professor Matsaganis' work has long focused on social policy, particularly that of Southern European countries, in the years following the Eurozone crisis, his work came to focus on the distributional effects of the crisis and resulting austerity measures that were felt most gravely in Southern Europe. While I've only just touched on Professor Matsaganis' many accomplishments, I'm eager to hear what he has to say about robots, platforms, and the future of work. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest.
Thank you so much for being here. This is a rather new thing for me, robots and all that. I come from a rather different area. I'm into social policy, social protection, the labor market, labor economics. And it has occurred to me that what we have known all these years may be about to be transformed in a rather dramatic way under the impact of automation on the one hand and platforms on the other hand. So I started to read frantically about these things, and this is more or less what I have come up with. So I'm not going to present any new research, empirical research, not my own empirical research, there is no such thing yet, but my presentation aims to try and make sense of a few interconnected issues that are to do with these three themes: the nature of what we are facing, the current technological revolution, how it's going to affect, or how it is already affecting labor markets, and what it all means for social protection. My presentation is quite European, inevitably, in the sense that I'm influenced by my own, the context of welfare states in Europe, in Italy and elsewhere, but I have tried to, it's a global issue, so I have tried to make it more relevant to you, but we can talk about that in a minute. So the three questions I'm going to pose and try to answer, tentatively at least, are these. First, are we about to witness the end of work? Or what's going to happen is probably going to be rather different, slightly different. The second question is how the platform economy changes employment. Massively is a short answer. And the third question, what might be the policy responses? Should we just sit back and wait for things to evolve, or is there anything we can do to deal with the technological revolution that we are facing? Of course, The End of Work was the title of a book by Jeremy Rifkin a few years ago, quarter of a century ago already. It was a rather dramatic forecast. It was a provocation more than a forecast. But I mean, that kind of things have been coming up all the time, and not the latest book, a book by Brynjolfsson and McAfee from MIT 5 years ago made rather stark predictions about why this technological revolution is different to the ones that have preceded it. So their point was that this current technological change is going to leave behind an awful lot of people, perhaps forever, as it races ahead. So some kinds of workers will become obsolete, computers will replace them, robots, and the implications may be stark. How stark? Well, there was a paper that was first published 5 years ago. It took a lot for it to find its way to a peer-reviewed journal by Frey and Osborne at the University of Oxford in the UK, who made the prediction that the number of workers, the share of workers who face high risk of automation, and they define high risk as probability of losing their job over and above 70%. So that share of workers whose job is threatened by automation may be as high as 50% or even higher. Okay, so that you can imagine the headlines, you know, press the panic button. And there was more to come. Nevertheless, if we look back at what people wrote 20 years ago, perhaps 100 years ago, and you know, I'll give you some examples of things people wrote 6 centuries ago, you will see similar things, similar concerns. And it's often the case that these concerns were voiced at a time of crisis. So John Maynard Keynes, the renowned economist, wrote about the future of technology and employment in the aftermath of the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression of 1929, 1932. But even in the 1970s or in the 1980s, just after the 2 big oil crises of 1973 and 1979, there was quite a lot of concern in Northern Europe, in Northern America, in Europe, and the South Pacific and elsewhere, in the industrialized world, even Japan, about the implications of technology. And it's funny that at that time, it was Americans who were more pessimistic about it and Europeans who were more optimistic. It is the other way around now. So Luc Sotte, who has written widely about these things, made the point that in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a fear that microelectronics, which was the new thing at the time, was about to cause massive job destruction. And of course, if you go back to the 1930s, as I just said, Keynes and others thought about technology, and they said, well, Keynes said, you know, it may be that we have no answer to the problem posed by technology, and you know, it may be that the advance of technology will make some part of work as we know it, as they knew it at the time, unnecessary. He put a rather optimistic spin on it. He said, well, it may not be a big deal. You know, it may be the end of scarcity, and isn't it a great thing? So, you know, it was pure speculation, of course, and and actually the title of his essay was "Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren." I have a very fond, you know, I'm very fond of this particular essay by Maynard Keynes, and I advise you to read it all. You know, he ended by saying that, well, who knows? It may be that we can all work 4 or 5 hours a day, and that's it. You know, isn't it great? Yes, of course, it's great. But his prediction was that technology is going to make a large share of what is necessary, the amount of work that is necessary to produce what we need, and he went on to discuss what is it that we really need. Do we really need all these things, or is it that we just want them but not need them, blah, blah, blah. But in any case, the amount of work that is necessary to produce these things is going to be reduced by technology. And if we play our cards right, we may be able to work less, all of us. Not just some people, many people unemployed and others workaholics, but everybody working 4 or 5 hours a day. And isn't that great? Well, of course it is. As I said a few minutes ago, some of these things go back in the midst of history, in the midst of time. So I came across this lovely quote in the book by Robinson and Acemoglu, The End of Nations, which refers to technology and destructive and creative aspects of technology at the same time. And they unearthed this quotation. Apparently in the late 16th century, there was this guy who had been a priest, a vicar, but also a Cambridge educated person. He had been to university. And he noticed that he heard that the Queen, Queen Elizabeth I, had published an edict by which all subjects of the Queen were required to wear a knitted cap, right? And he spotted a business opportunity. And then he noticed that his wife and sister or daughter, I can't remember what, would work the hands out in the dim light, working hours on end. And he said, hang on a moment, what if we created a machine to help them along? And he spent a few years being an inventor, and he was technologically minded. And he came up with a stocking frame, and he wrote to his local MP, Member of Parliament, and his MP arranged for him an audience with the Queen, which is great. So he went to London, he rented a large apartment in which he installed his stocking frame, and he anxiously waited for the Queen to come along and give him permission to mass produce knitted caps that the Queen wanted all subjects to wear. But the Queen was very unimpressed, and actually she was jellied. She said, who do you think you are? If you do what you hope to do, so many of my subjects will be out of work, where they will be, the crime will go up, and my kingdom will no longer be a happy kingdom, and we can't have you do that. So no, and that was it. End of story. Even earlier, in the early 15th century, in 1412, it's amazing that these things happened such a long time ago. In the city of Cologne, a city I love and visit often, another guy, Walter Kessinger, went to the municipal council, and he presented his plan for a rudimentary spinning wheel that will accelerate production of textiles. So the municipal council deliberated. Actually, they dedicated a session. They thought hard about it, and they came to the same conclusion as Queen Elizabeth I a few centuries later. They said, no, there are so many people in our city whose livelihood would be threatened by your spinning wheel. So, Mr. Kessinger, we can't have you do that. Sorry. The funny thing is, I love the conclusion. No spinning wheel shall be built and installed, not now, not at any time thereafter. Well, little did they know. Because as we all know, well, it took a bit of time. Towards the end of the 18th century, 1760, 1780, something called the Industrial Revolution did take place. A long time after Walter Kessinger in Cologne and Queen Elizabeth I, but it did happen eventually. And it was even more transformative than the first goes at spinning wheels and stocking frames. In the late 18th century, spinning machines allowed one single skilled worker who operated the machine to produce the same quantity as 200 workers used to do before that. Can you imagine? One worker replaced 200 workers who worked with their hands, with no machine. Well, we now know that the Industrial Revolution put an end to the so-called Malthusian trap. Have you heard of the theories of Malthus, the demographer and economist? He thought that at times of war and famine, there are fewer people around, population goes down, and hence there is enough food for everybody, and there is a shortage of workers. So wages will go up. And as wages go up, workers and their families will be encouraged to have more children. But as more children come along, there will be less food for everybody. So population will go down again, and wars and famines will help. And it was a very bleak view of humanity. Well, the Industrial Revolution, the Malthusian trap, actually described the way things were quite faithfully for a long time. Things really were more or less like that. But the Industrial Revolution put an end to that and led to an enormous rise in prosperity. Up until then, the standards of living in England, let alone other places, in 1700 were barely higher than at the time of the Roman conquest. Can you imagine? Centuries on end, no difference in living standards, stagnation. But of course, the Industrial Revolution led to an amazing, unprecedented rise in living standards. And also, life expectancy was what, 35, 40 up until then, and the Industrial Revolution and the rise in living standards and other things that happened as a consequence led to the modern rise in population and also in life expectancy and all that. Okay, so it was, if you look back with the benefit of hindsight to the Industrial Revolution, you will have to come to the conclusion that it was a great thing for humanity. But that was not how people who lived, contemporary people who lived through the Industrial Revolution saw it. Or this is not how most people saw it, because of course for a few industrialists it was a great opportunity for enrichment and amazing wealth. But what about the 199 people who lost their job as a result of the new spinning wheel? They were bitter and resentful. And of course they didn't sit back to let things go. Some of them organized, and the most symbolic of the many rebellions that took place in Britain, because this is where the Industrial Revolution started, in the early 19th century was the Luddite Rebellion. And I'm sure you have heard of the Luddites. I grew up, it's an exaggeration, but after university and so on, I always thought of the Luddites as the prototype of the doomed rebellion, right? That's not the way to do things. How can you resist technology? You're going to lose in the end. Think of something different. That's how I thought of the Luddites. Actually, when I wrote this paper, I dug into the historical record a bit more, and I found to my amazement that the Luddites were rather successful in the sense that they did manage, in the areas in which they were strong, to delay the changes that were happening at the time, and hence the loss of work that other areas experienced. And one of the most renowned historians of the 20th century, Eric Hobsbawm, who happened to be a Marxist also, so he was, I think he had a soft spot for Luddites and others, pointed out to the fact, which I found very reasonable, that at the time there were no workers' rights, basically, and the state of employment relations was pitiful, and so the Luddites, the people who rebelled against machines, had very few alternatives. So the riot, which was violent in some cases, was the equivalent of, collective bargaining. They didn't have the right to unionize. They didn't have the right to sit down with employers and agree terms and conditions. All they could do was riot, and so it was quite successful at the time. And it was so successful that the British Army sent more troops to suppress the Luddite Rebellion than to fight Napoleon in Spain. I thought that was amazing. So much for the Luddites. Well, the thing is that, okay, we now know, actually, the Industrial Revolution was the reason we know that technological change has two phases. On the one hand, it destroys jobs. On the other hand, it creates other jobs, different jobs, perhaps performed by different people in different areas. So the dislocations can be massive. But the balance, in the end of the day, is often positive, in the sense that more and better jobs are created than lost, right? And people like Joseph Schumpeter, an ingenious economist of Austrian origin, Austro-Hungarian origin, who lived in Britain. He wrote this book about capitalism, socialism, and democracy, and he made the point, he was one of the early theorists of innovation, and he formulated his theory of creative destruction at about that time, in the mid-20th century. And it's a fascinating way to look at things, and I think correct. It has proved correct so far, at the very least. Well, the point to note, however, is that the creative part and the destructive part do not happen at the same time. First destruction, then, if we are all lucky, after several decades perhaps, creation. And this was the experience of the Industrial Revolution. There is a debate among economic historians. You know the joke that we economists are very good at predicting the past. Sometimes we're not even good at that. We disagree about what happened. But anyway, I think the balance of opinion in the profession of economic historians is that living standards following the Industrial Revolution, which happened in 1760, 1780, did not start to rise until the mid-19th century, 70 years later. Can you imagine? The people whose lives were transformed and perhaps ruined by the arrival of these new fantastic machines did not improve at all. Never, not even their children's lives, perhaps their grandchildren's lives, yes, which is, I think, quite important to remember. So, it's all very, very well to say, well, the industry. I'm one of those people who look upon technical change rather benevolently. I think it's a great thing. But we all have to remember that there are gains and losses, there are winners and losers, and you have to do something about the losers if you want things to move at all smoothly. But we'll come back to that later. We've seen creative destruction several times in history so far. Think of the way this country, the US, was 100 years ago, the industry that employed by far the more workers was farming. You know, most Americans were farmers in the early 20th century. And now farming employs what, 1% of the workforce? So what happened to the millions of farmers? Did they become unemployed? Well, some of them did for a few years, but not for long, because as manufacture grew, farmers moved from villages or the countryside to cities to take up jobs as manufacturer workers. And then 50 years later, after the Second World War, more or less the same pattern repeated itself with the transition from manufacturing to services. Employment in factories first stopped to grow, then started to decline. From the 1960s, 1970s, actually it started to decline. But unemployment did not go up on the whole. The workers who were displaced in one sector found employment in another sector, and that was services, of course. So I think it's fair to say that creative destruction is the defining feature of a market economy. All right. Does all this have any bearing on what we are talking about today, the current technological change? Well, I hope so. So it's good to try and find out what, you know, we know about the share of workers, perhaps 50%, Frey and Osborne, whose jobs are threatened by machines. But what about job creation elsewhere in the economy? Do we see any of that? Well, I think we do, or at least this is what people whom I admire and respect think. For example, Acemoglu, the MIT professor, and Restrepo, a younger economist at Boston University. Last year, they published a number of papers in which they pointed out, they analyzed and tried to shed light on the nature of countervailing effects. In other words, sources of job creation as a result of automation. So they made these 3 points. First of all, that new innovative technologies, almost by definition, improve productivity, right? What happens when productivity goes up is that everything becomes cheaper because less work is required to produce it, so prices fall. You know, I'm 55 years old and my first computer was bought in 1987, and it was, you know, it was very heavy. It was a laptop. I think it was the first laptop in history, and I was so proud. And you know, it was portable as a laptop, but not really, because it was so heavy that, you know, even a strong 24-year-old couldn't carry it around for that long. And you know, it was very expensive. It was perhaps 3 times as expensive as a Mac or whatever. And it was, I don't know how many million times less powerful. Now the entire, well anyway, I could explain, but I don't think I would make any sense to you, because, you know, these things are really obsolete. There wasn't you know, the way to run programs in the computer was in a floppy. You know, you had a floppy, and the great thing about that particular laptop of mine was that it had 2 floppy disks, one in which you recorded your text and things, and the other in which you had your program, you know, word processor or whatever. And it was very expensive. You know, now you have things that work so much better, computers, but not only computers, at a fraction of the original price. And this is a productivity effect. You know, we become richer, not necessarily because we earn more, but because we can buy more and better things at a lower price. The other thing is a capital accumulation effect. Here the idea is that some processes have already been automated. So new progress on automation in those particular processes that have already been automated caused no employment losses, because all the employment losses have already happened in the previous wave of automation. So the new wave of automation can only do good. It can only improve productivity with no loss of employment. And this is a capital deepening effect. And the third source of dynamism in the labor market comes from new jobs, new tasks, new industries, things that we didn't suspect might emerge only a few years ago. And there is some evidence that the greatest boost to employment actually comes from new jobs and industries. 60% of the 50 million jobs added over the last 40 years, perhaps in the US, are associated with new tasks, new jobs, new industries. Bessen, a BU professor, wrote a book a few years ago in which he pointed out to the fact that the introduction of ATMs in banks, perhaps you remember, or perhaps you are too young to remember, that when ATMs first came along, bank employees panicked. They thought, that's it, we are doomed. We might as well change job. But that was not what happened. In the US, for example, as ATMs spread, banking employment grew because banks found it profitable to open new branches. Also, it was a good time for the economy, the Clinton boom and all that. But ATMs didn't do any harm. It's just that banking employees, rather than counting banknotes, did other things. Talk to people for a change, to clients. So it was more satisfactory to them and it was more profitable to the banks with no job loss. Right. Okay, let's go back to the forecast of massive loss of employment because of automation. That was, we may say, the first generation of such estimates, although it only happened 5 years ago. And I have already mentioned the paper by Frey and Osborne. 47% of US workers are threatened, their job is threatened by automation. And there was a similar study in Germany, a highly industrialized country, that found that 59% of workers faced unemployment as a result of automation. Well, there was a new crop of studies that brought numbers down considerably. One in Germany, 15%, and two studies commissioned by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation and Development. They are doing a rather great job. They have a, I don't know how to call it, a unit, a research unit called the Future of Work, and they do an awful lot of analysis and they commission others to do analysis. And the last two papers were published by the OECD, and they found that if you change the methodology, if you do it in a different way, and if you go to better data and so on, you will find that perhaps the share of US jobs threatened by automation may be as low as 10%, which is not low at all, but it's lower than 47%. In fact, even those guys who had produced the earlier estimates which made the headlines and caused people to panic were careful at the time to say that, well, this is one part of what's going on, the job destruction part. There is the other part, which is job creation, and we don't know how it will all end up. And there are, you can read the quotations, even the MIT researchers who wrote in 2012 about the current technological revolution, and they said that this time is different and massive disruption and all that. they ended by saying that they are confident that most of these changes will be beneficial ones. So, you know, we may not be faced by the end of work after all. So is this all right then? Can we go home and forget about it? Well, not exactly. Because even though the end of work may not be very near, the massive dislocation of workers and jobs and industries is a reality. And it's likely to be even more of a reality. I am personally, well, I have formed the opinion, I shouldn't say convinced, because who knows, but, you know, I think that we're not, actually, our real problem is not the end of work, that robots will do everything and we will just sit idle and have nothing to do and so on. I think the issue is slightly different, that there will be quite a lot of work, but jobs will be lost for some people and created for other people. In some areas, not other areas. So there will be massive disruption. And you know, the real issue for public policy is what to do about it. Is there anything we can do? Even Nedelkowska and Quintini, the OECD study, the authors of the OECD study, which came up with a rather low estimate of 10% of US workers faced by job loss because of automation, they pointed out that, you know, even 10% is 13 million jobs. It's quite a lot. And you know, what is the closest disruption in history to that? Well, it's the decline of the car industry in Detroit and the Midwest. And you know, that was very painful. And you know, we still live with the consequences of that. So actually 13 million jobs would be several times the disruption experienced in Detroit and the transition from Motown to Murder Town. We don't want to live through that again, not at a scale of several times more. And we do know that the effects of automation on employment are very asymmetric. We already know that. At first, labor economists thought that the effects of automation on employment are skill-based. In other words, high skills are all right, low skills are doomed. Well, Otto, the MIT labor economist, and others have pointed out that actually it's a bit more complicated than that. It's routine biased rather than skill biased. In other words, there are some routine manual tasks, think of factory work, that are very exposed to the risk of automation. And there are other manual tasks, non-routine, think of carers, people looking after children or the elderly, whose jobs are actually not likely to be replaced by a robot anytime soon. Because people know more than they think they know. You know, we do things like looking after a baby or, you know, holding the hands of an elderly person or cooking or whatever, without realizing that we do. If somebody asks us how to do it, we'll be challenged. You know, how do you explain things that you do innately? So routine tasks will be replaced even when they are non-manual. You know, a large part of a young lawyer's day may be, or at least that was the case until recently, may be spent poring over legal precedents, you know, going back in time to see how other judges judged similar cases differently, and then tell others. Well, you know, a computer can do that much more efficiently than any human lawyer can do. So some tasks are threatened by automation, or arguably they can be performed much better by machines than by humans. even when they are non-manual. So it's not true that blue-collar jobs are doomed, white-collar jobs are all right. It doesn't work like this. And the discriminating factor is routine or non-routine. If what you do is smart, or it has this kind of emotional intelligence even, if not necessarily normal intelligence, then probably your job is going to survive and perhaps proliferate, multiply. Which is good news for some and bad news for others. And recent research has shown that this is how the job market has evolved in recent decades. There has been polarization. And actually, if you map routine, non-routine on the skill axis, you will find that it's middle-skilled jobs that are most exposed to the risk of automation. Factory workers used to be the aristocracy of labor, not childminders. But it is factory workers who are more at risk of automation, whereas childminders are not, apparently. Why? Well, one of the explanations of job polarization that I have found appealing was formulated by Italian economist, professor at Berkeley, California, Enrico Moretti. He pointed out to the fact that he did the empirical research and came up with numbers that if you have somebody in a high-tech sector, a worker in Microsoft, moving to Seattle, for example, the number of jobs in Seattle will not go up by 1 by that person, but by 5 almost. Why? Because that person will create demand for other businesses in industries like restaurants, real estate, cleaning, legal, medical, personal services, whatever. Actually, all jobs, all workers have local multiplying effects. But high-tech workers have a higher multiplier. So if a factory job moved to Seattle, total employment would go up by 1.6 jobs, found Moretti. If a skilled job in another industry moved to Seattle, the number of jobs in Seattle would go up by 2.5, but a high-tech job by almost 5. This is one of the causes of job polarization. A Microsoft job is high skill, and all these other 4 jobs, right, in cleaning, restaurants, well, legal is not necessarily low skill, but real estate, construction. So you have very little in the middle. Actually, the middle is hollowed out. No more factory work, right? But high tech and low tech, right? And this is job polarization. So the local multiplier is one of the explanations. And there is evidence from Europe that shows very similar findings. Actually, Goose and others, Dutch economists, found a local multiplier of 5, which is uncannily close to what Moretti had found. All right, let's move to the second theme of my presentation, which is not automation, but the platform economy. This is also part of the move towards digitalization, but it's different. Some people, and I quote De Griese, who's a Belgian economist working for the European Trade Unions Institute, so a labor guy. Some people are rather put off by platforms. I think they don't like them. They just hate them. And Uber an American firm, awful. And you know, he wrote this diatribe against Uber, saying, "What is this? You know, they don't have cars even. You know, they don't have licenses. They don't need to worry about insurance, MOT. This is roadworthiness tests. They can have self-appointed drivers, blah blah blah." And you know, here it is, a mushrooming industry that risks disrupting our trusted taxi services. Yeah, he didn't say that, but I think he implied it. Many people are hostile. And you know, think of Uber. Uber is not legal in Germany, for example. You know, the German government has resisted Uber. Italy, the same. They're allowed to do Uber Eats, but not, you know, car sharing. So one has to ask themselves, is such hostility justified? Well, you know, I come from a country in which taxi services are not very high quality, and you know, not many people from where I come will defend the actual state of the taxi industry. Expensive, rude, not convenient, blah, blah, blah. So I happen to think that these new platforms actually fulfill a role. They cater for people's needs, and you know, this is what makes them so successful. And the same goes for Airbnb vis-a-vis hotels. You know, again, there is a positive side and a negative side. If Airbnb hosts do offer the same services as a hotel without having to respond to regulatory and tax and you know other legislation, then that's unfair competition and it's wrong. But I don't think this is the end of the story. This is not even most of the story. You know, Airbnb is successful because there are many people who prefer actually to stay in other people's homes rather than go to a hotel. I do it all the time, you know. So, but one has to feel sorry for those who stay behind. I lived a few years ago. I spent 3.5 years living in London, right? And I never took taxis because they are so expensive. Well, perhaps once. But you know, black cabs in London, they are an institution. And you know, they are safe, they are clean, they are efficient, they are expensive, all right. And the other thing about black cabbies is that they know everything. You know, they know all streets. And that has always amazed me until I found out that this is part of their training. And in order to become a black cabbie, you have to actually take an exam. And the exam is that you have to memorize all streets in London within a radius of, what, 6 miles from Charing Cross. That's 25,000 streets. I can barely remember where I live, you know, let alone 25,000 streets. You know, it's amazing. It's wonderful. But it's so vulnerable to computers. You know, what's the point of memorizing 25,000 streets when Google Maps can do it in no time, you know? So you feel sorry for these people who have invested so much doing something that is pointless at the end of the day. All right. And you know, I have very similar feelings in a bout of self-doubt about MOOCs, you know? So you have to think, we university professors have to ask ourselves, what is it that we do better than those Harvard, MIT professors who, you know, record their lectures and they make them available to everybody, you know? Yeah, all right, fair enough. You know, why should we resist MOOCs? And you know, think about children in sub-Saharan Africa in a village in which the closest university is 200 kilometers away, and there is no way for them to attend university. But they can go to the local library and you know, log on and expose themselves to brilliant professors talking about fantastic things for free. You know, I think that's great. Is it going to threaten the livelihood of local professors? Oh, yes, of course it will, but so what? I mean, they have to think of something else. We have to think of something else. I'm not entirely sure what this else is, but I guess, offer a more personalized service, talk to people, you, students, try to tutor students things that you cannot do from a distance. But if we fail to do that, then we deserve to lose our claim on a tenure job. Well, it won't happen to us, I think, but it may happen to others like us in the near future. So I think the right approach is to say, regulate. You don't want MOOCs that spread fake knowledge. You don't want to do that. But other than that, why resist it? All right. Nevertheless, from the point of view of those who work in the platform economy, things are less bright, I think. And here we witness the labor market is becoming more liquid. Once things were solid, you knew that you were either an employee or a self-employed person, for example. Now you don't. What are Uber employees? Are they freelancers, as Uber claims, or are they dependent workers who should have the right to form a union, to receive unemployment compensation, paid holidays, maternity leave, sickness leave? Why not? And this is what many of them thought. 385,000 in Massachusetts and California, and took Uber to court a few years ago. I think it was the year 2014. And eventually, Uber decided, rather than risk losing a legal battle that would force the company to change its business model, in other words, start treating drivers as employees rather than as freelancers, as the Uber had wanted, rather than face this risk, Uber decided to pay $100 million to buy the drivers who sued it out. Right? So this is how valuable this business model is for Uber. Very valuable. But of course it does raise questions, and questions that are very difficult to answer. There is a term for self-employed workers, or rather for workers who are treated by their employers as self-employed, whereas in fact they only have one client, their employer. And the term is bogus self-employment. Drivers are not exactly in that category, because many drivers work for both Uber and Lyft, and in New York they have even more options. But they come close enough to being bogus self-employed. And this is a problem, because by being self-employed you lose your right to unemployment compensation, even maternity leave, sickness leave, blah, blah, blah. If you're out of work, it's like not having enough clients rather than becoming unemployed. It's very different, conceptually different. So there has been something of a burgeoning industry among labor economists trying to find out whether Uber workers are happy. Well, not happy, but whether they earn enough, and whether they work for Uber voluntarily or because they combine Uber work with studying or family responsibility, what have you. The question is, would it be right to treat these people as employees, or is it much better to have them freelancers with all the flexibility and some of the risks that freelance work entails, right? Last year, 2 major studies came out. One actually funded by Uber itself. But it was a real study. Kruger is one of the best labor economists we have. He would never put his name under a study that was anything less than of the highest standards. Anyway, they did a survey and they got back feedback from 600 drivers in 2014 and 800 in the year after. And they found rather good things for Uber, basically. That most drivers valued the flexibility. They chose the hours and days of work. Uber drivers are not like taxi drivers in outlook, the age, sex, skill, composition. They are more like the general population. So Uber is not something people do professionally. It's something that we all do in our time off, more or less. And the third finding was, although it's complicated, it appears that Uber drivers earn at least as much as taxi drivers. So everything is fine, and we don't need to worry about that. All right. I respect this study, but I was really amazed by another study in which 40,000 and 60,000 drivers were questioned. The data for them were analyzed in the city of New York. And it was not just Uber, but also Lyft, Via, Jet, Juno, and so on. That came out in August, this study. And it was commissioned by the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission. I love this name for the commission, Taxi and Limousine. All right. So they worked backwards. They said, what's the minimum wage in New York? $15 an hour, right. So if you are an Uber driver or Lyft driver, in order to make the minimum wage, you need to earn more than $15 an hour because you have to pay for petrol, wear and tear, insurance, blah, blah, blah. You have costs. So they added them all up, and they said, right, the equivalent of the minimum wage for an employee, which is $15 in New York, would be $17.22, right? So let's find out how many drivers make less than $17.22 per hour. And they found that even though most drivers worked full-time, 85% earned less than 17.22, which is amazing. Actually, it was so amazing that New York City Council did two things. The study came out in August, last August. The first thing was a total freeze on new license for car sharing, ride sharing services in the city. They said, let's take a break. We freeze licenses. Whoever has already got a license, fine, but no more new license, all right? While we are thinking about that. The second thing that they did immediately in August was to ask the council, ask the commission, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, to think about ways to ensure that Uber and Lyft and other drivers made at least the minimum wage. In other words, to extend minimum wage legislation to freelance workers in car sharing, ride sharing platforms, right? And the commission reported in December, just before the holidays. And they came up with a complicated formula, which is meant to ensure that once you do everything, the per minute, per mile payment, which is more or less the way taxes work, there are two dimensions, time and distance. Same here. So they came up with this formula that they have made it compulsory, which, if they have done their sums right, will ensure that drivers make at least $17.22 an hour. The reaction of Uber and Lyft was not favorable. They hated it. They said, Lyft said, this is a tragedy for all New Yorkers, more or less. Uber said, terrible, and so on. But it's now the law since a couple of weeks ago, and we'll monitor. Everybody will watch to see how that goes. In Europe, it's still, platform work is still rather marginal. There are various estimates, but for the time being, the share of workers engaged in platform work is rather low, depending how you define it, of course. Maybe no more than 2%. So the last part is what we can do to deal with the transformations. Nobody has a clue, basically. I mean, we do have ideas, but not much more than that. What is clear is that the areas in which public policy is needed are three: education and training, labor law, and social protection. It's obvious that when you have massive dislocations in the labor market, you need to prepare workers for these changes. So reskilling, upskilling is the key word. But it's important, and it works. We know that German workers who lost their job because of automation did much better than US workers who lost their jobs because of automation. US workers drifted into inactivity or early retirement or unemployment. German workers, most of them found jobs elsewhere, in some cases better paid. So it works. But it's not a panacea, and it's difficult, because those were, even in Germany, those workers who have the greatest need for requalification are the least likely to know it and ask for it. So it's always more highly skilled workers who look for chances, opportunities to acquire new skills. So it is effective but difficult. Labor law, I'll skip it. It's about how to treat self-employed workers. It's not easy. Nobody has a clue, really. Very difficult. There are some ideas. It's in the paper. A discussion of things that Germany and Austria and Italy have done, but there are marginal solutions. Social protection. Well, here the key is to ensure that all people, irrespective of how their employment position is defined, have access to at least a basic level of social protection. Universal health, for instance, childcare. Basic income is something that many people are curious about, and I'm quite curious myself. But even if you don't go all the way to a universal basic income, an amount of money paid to everybody on a monthly basis, or the US alternative of a grant, a capital grant at age 18 or 21, even if you don't go all the way to that, the idea that certain things should be guaranteed to people irrespective of how they earn their living, I think it's correct, and it helps you introduce a level of flexibility that allows people to move without anxiety and stress in the labor market in order to maximize the benefits of technical change that are undeniable. Okay, I better stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me.